work in developing countries. We do a little bit of work in the United States around environmental education, but our foundation has 3 sort of main focus areas. One, which is focused on girls' education, which I'll be speaking about today, and then 21st century skills, social and emotional learning, and environmental learning. So due to technical difficulties, I am not able to share my slides, but there's not a ton of information in them. So I was asked to do a little bit of landscaping just to provide some context for our conversation today, and then I'll do a deep dive into some of our work in 9 minutes. So for many of you here, you already work in the field of gender, and so I don't think you need much context that the situation is absolutely improving. When we look at the data for girls' enrollment, we can feel really positive about that. Girls are completing more years of schooling than ever. A greater number of girls are enrolled. Fantastic. However, that doesn't tell the full picture. If we really look at the data that's missing, and we look at the poorest of the poor, the girls that are in the most rural, girls in conflict settings, girls who are not able to be included in the data sets, we see a very different story. And only 44% of countries have fully committed to gender parity in education. So again, we can rally around the countries that are improving their statistics, that are really committed to gender parity and feel really positive about the direction and the trends. But if we take a more holistic view, not only of the kinds of girls that are getting included into these numbers, we see that a lot are being left behind. In sub-Saharan Africa, 75% of girls enter primary. Yay, that's great. Only 8% make it through secondary school. Well, it's not so good. And so as we're looking for the SDG and the shift from universal enrollment from the MDGs, where the real sort of target was getting girls into classrooms, to the shift of quality education and lifelong learning, we can see that we have a lot of work left to do. So the many that are in school but not are learning, and then those who are excluded from the classrooms in the beginning, or those who, through largely the adolescent period, face attrition. As you touched on a little bit with conflict areas, girls are just proportionately affected by conflict and excluded from the classroom, partially due to the necessities in the home. Girls just have more responsibilities with child rearing, with domestic responsibilities, but also sexual exploitation into the classroom, sexual exploitation in exchange for grades, violence on the way to the classroom or in the school context. And so I wanted to bring in, we're obviously here under the auspices of education and SDG 4, but SDG 5, which is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, clearly can't be possible unless we achieve the success of SDG 4. So I just wanted to flag that as something for our conversation. So a few examples of our work. We take a very holistic view of girls in education. So that sort of rudimentary, well, let's get girls in the classroom, was a great starting place. But now we want to look at the context of the entire educational experience for girls and young women, which includes leadership, which includes changing knowledge, attitude, and beliefs within communities, but also within curriculum. The messages that we're sharing with our girls when they enter into the academic journey, and then partially the reasons that they're leaving is because of the knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and values held within their communities and indeed their curriculum in their schools. So some of the work that we've been doing as a funding partner, I wanted to give you an example of a partner we're working with in rural India with Girl Icons, which are empowering young women to take on a community leadership role. So often our work is developed out of context, whether it's the United States or Canada, and we have an empowerment program and it's going to be amazing, and then we go to the place and we do it for 2 years or 5 years or whatever, or we collect some data and the program really doesn't take off. What is exciting to us about the Girl Icon program is it really puts the ownership and the onus on the community to develop leadership within. So it's not, we're empowering a girl, we're coming from the outside to give her something she's lacking, but really helping unlock the potential that she has within herself already. Another partner that we work with is the Creative Action Institute in the East Africa Girls Leadership Summit. In the East Africa Girls Leadership Summit, we bring together girls from Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, Tanzania, and Sierra Leone. There's 2 parts. One's a mentor training for local organizations where the mentors come and receive training multiple times throughout the year. It's a 2-year program to ensure that all the girls that are in this program have accurate information and mentorship. But the real change happens at the level of the girls who come from disenfranchised communities, pastoralist communities, communities where girls are not valued, where child marriage is high, female genital mutilation, the list of various factors that prohibit girls from receiving a good education. And through mentorship, they're able to develop not only themselves, but their communities and projects. And we've had girls in rural Kenya take on female genital mutilation or child marriage and say, we're not doing this in our community. And really engage local leaders within their school communities, but also within the broader community. And so what's exciting to us about both the Girl Icon program and the East Africa Girls Leadership Summit is, again, it's very locally driven within the context. So many times the context is either focused on the sort of easier populations to reach, where we're in an urban slum and we're focused just within the urban slum, but we've forgotten about the pastoralist communities or those that are in a conflict setting, such as Somalia.
You're at 6 months.
Okay, great. And so the themes that I wanted to lay for our discussion around Schools 2030, and when we're looking at the data sets that can really inform policy change and create, hopefully, the needle being pushed a little further in gender equity and parity that I don't think we've really seen yet, are to make sure that we include and are focused on the most disadvantaged, the rural participants, the disabled students, the poorest of the poor that aren't included in many of our data sets. To be cognizant of the local context where it is that we're working. So when the idea of scaling and replicating programs, that we're not looking at doing the same thing in an urban setting and a rural setting in vastly different cultural contexts. I wanted to talk a lot about the data gaps that exist. So many of our data sets, like I mentioned at the beginning, when we're looking at the girls who are enrolled in school, don't take into account the girls that are completely excluded, and how we as a community can do better, but also ask upon our policymakers, our governments. Canada's marked it as an important factor for international investment. Not every country is there. And so I think we can use our voices collectively to escalate that. Looking at the traditional values and beliefs in communities and curricula, if the textbooks that are being used are perpetuating gender stereotypes, perpetuating the necessity of women's work in the home, it's going to be much harder for those girls to overcome the boundaries throughout adolescence. And then social and emotional learning and 21st century skills. What we found is the story of girl education is not education. We also need to look at, are they receiving the improved learning outcomes in math and English and local languages and those things, which are pretty easy to track. But more than that, we found the communities that are coming from are often hostile, that the violence against girls within their homes, whether it's conflict or it's just within their domestic context, makes it difficult for them to continue in school and or to focus when they're in the classroom. And so we like better data, also looking at the different interventions that can assist with girls learning in more rural contexts and girls learning in more conflict-ridden areas, looking at ICT potential, recognizing again with this localized context that taking an ICT tool that's developed in Boston or Oxford and then applying that to a context where it's not applicable, we won't really see the gains. But how do we help support and develop tools in the most, as Michael Tricano would say from the World Bank, the most remote, the most challenging, the most impossible and expensive and most likely to fail context, because if it works there, it'll work anywhere, versus developing it and then scaling it out, where oftentimes the funding isn't there to scale out, and if it is, the context isn't appropriate. As of right now, it's pretty safe to say that the SDGs will not be met by 2030 due to a lack of funding and a lack of cohesion and cooperation amongst stakeholders and a lack of data. The lack of data, what we currently have, and the lack of data that we're looking at collecting as we move forward. So I think the Schools 2030 program will fill a very important void in the data collection of, in our context, what gender factors and what gender lens needs to be applied for the success of the SDGs. Sorry about the slides.
Wonderful. All right. Let us jump straight into a more specific Afghan context.
Yeah, sure. So let me just briefly introduce myself again. My name is Symonds, and I work for Afghan Foundation in Afghanistan, leading a consortium specifically working on girls' education. So we'll get a bit more into the details later. Obviously the themes of the conference are all around uncertainty and the changing nature of society, and just like Somalia, those themes are really relevant for Afghanistan. It's a context where a huge amount of change has happened in quite a small time. Obviously, we all know that until 2001 we had a very restrictive, didactic regime. After the fall of the Taliban in 2001, there's been a huge amount of investment in infrastructure, in education, healthcare services, governance systems, and security. That investment has yielded better returns in some sectors than in others. The education sector, for one, is widely cited as one of the success stories because prior to 2001, we had a very, very small number of children in school. Almost all of them were boys. And since then, we've made huge strides in the number of children and the number of girls who are managing to access school. We learned from UNICEF's recent study on out-of-school children that there are still about 3.5 million children out of school. About 75% of them are girls. So there's still quite a lot of effort that we still need to make to reach those remaining children. That data doesn't tell us the whole story because we also know that about 50% of the girls who enroll in school in grade 1 also drop out before they finish grade 6. So it means that the majority of girls in the country are still not receiving a full cycle of primary education, and even fewer are receiving a full cycle of secondary education. Now, at the policy level in Afghanistan, we have a huge momentum around girls' education at the moment. I think it's recognized as a priority, by the ministry, by donors, by implementers. There's a push to meeting this, meeting SDG 4 and the commitments that we've all made, and recognizing that girls are the largest single marginalized group left in the country. So a couple of examples of those policy movements are the National Education Strategic Plan of 2017 to 2021, which sets goals to expand access, quality, and relevance of education and improve education management. And gender is mainstreamed into all three of those critical pillars. We also, very happily, in 2018, had the community-based education policy signed and endorsed by the Minister of Education. Community-based education it's a way to, it's a mechanism of outreach for reaching very remote rural communities, establishing classes there, and bringing children into the formal system when they don't have any access to formal government schools. And CBE is really a critical step in our aim to reach those remaining 3.5 million children. It's one of the only ways that we're going to get those children from being out of school into receiving a full cycle of education. And especially girls, because this factor of having a class close to your home is the number one step that we need to take to get girls into the school system. And in addition, the Ministry of Education, in partnership with UNICEF, is also currently developing a girls' education strategy, which is designed to kind of operationalize some of the goals in the NESP and look at them from a very gender-specific point of view, and to look at how exactly we are going to achieve those goals of access, quality, and relevance for girls specifically. Just going to talk a little bit about the Stages project. So we're a UK government-funded consortium led by the Aga Khan Foundation and working in partnership with CARE, Save the Children, Catholic Relief Services, Aga Khan Education Services, and Afghan Education Production Organization. We work in 16 provinces of Afghanistan, so managing to reach just about half of the country in total. And our goal is to increase access to quality education close to home for girls, but specifically for adolescent girls. And our main mechanism to do this is by operating community-based education, or CBE. But there's a whole program that goes around, simply establishing and providing CBE. We also have to work with the government schools, because once kids finish, a round of community-based education, they have to have a school to go to in order to continue their education after the project ends. So we do a lot of work to build the capacity of other government schools as well, to absorb children and to foster a more girl-friendly learning environment. We provide resources which are shown to increase girls' quality of learning, like libraries and science labs, as well as stationery and educational materials. We train teachers. We work with about 7,000 teachers across the country. So we train them in a whole range of important methodologies and subject content knowledge topics, but looking specifically at student-centered and inclusive education. So teaching them how to address the causes of educational marginalization in the community and find strategies to bring those marginalized children a slightly more quality learning experience. We're trying to increase the pool of female teachers who are available locally within these communities, because that's another critical barrier to getting girls into schools. So we're basically sponsoring quite a high number of female teaching students to attend teacher training colleges and become qualified teachers. And then we're also looking at building the leadership and professional skills of the adolescent girls themselves, through peer groups, through paraprofessional and vocational training with labour market linkages, to help them complete that journey from school to, ideally, employability. So the first phase of our project really highlighted the CBE approach in supporting education for girls. So our endline evaluation for the first phase of the project demonstrated that when you compare stages supported government schools to stages implemented CBE classes, CBE students were outperforming the government schools. And going a little bit further, in our recent baseline evaluation for the second phase of our project, we also looked at those two evaluation arms, as well as a comparison group of non-project supported government schools. And we found that our girls who we supported in both CBE and government schools were scoring better on literacy and numeracy than girls that we weren't supporting. And that CBE students were performing the highest of all. So in that sense, some of the most marginalized girls were able to climb to the top of the ladder in terms of learning outcomes. And we also see a great success story when it comes to transition. So in CBE, we have about 95% of girls from the beginning of the project to the end of the project staying in school. But of course, it's not a silver bullet. It's successful in a lot of ways, and there are challenges and questions that we're facing every day and trying our best to overcome. So of course in Afghanistan we still rely quite a lot on donor funding for support. And when you're going into communities and mobilizing them around girls' education, you have to be quite careful about how you manage expectations when it comes to sustainability. So we know that in a lot of our areas, the Ministry of Education does still lack the resources to go there and to open schools or to get girls into the nearest government school. So we have to be quite careful about how we manage those expectations, because as implementers we are creating a demand where there's not always the supply. To address this, we're looking at piloting some system-level changes, trying to pave the way towards sustainability of community-based education. These are priorities that have been outlined in the National Education Strategic Plan and the CBE policy, because we want to ensure that marginalised girls can continue to access education close to home in the future. And just a couple of examples of these, I can go into a bit more detail maybe in the questions if there's more interest. But a couple of the areas that we're working on is, one of which is to, instead of handing over community-based education to the management of the Ministry of Education, we're looking at whether it is possible to hand over management of CBE classes to community development councils, which are local governance structures within the community. And in this way, we would, in theory, have a program which the community is able to manage and maintain after our funding and our presence in that community ends. And another thing that we're doing, just quickly because I think my time is up, is AKF has just developed a multi-grade teaching package. One of the problems with CBE is that it's usually run as a one cohort model. So you enroll a cohort of students, you provide them education for 4 years, but you don't enroll other students into that class once the first year of students has been taken in. So the younger students in the community kind of miss out on the CBE program that's offered. So how we're trying to counter this is to teach teachers to manage different grades within the same class, so that we can have, at least within a CBE project lifetime, we can have a model where the class is able to enroll younger students every year. And I guess I'll just finish this.
Thank you. I feel less guilty about letting you roll over because I was going to ask you exactly to name specific examples of sustainability, and now we can save that time to discussion. So that was fantastic. Thank you. Michelle, I'll put up your picture, but you can go ahead and take off.
I guess I'll just say about myself is I'm the unusual person of actually teaching at a university, and I mean that literally. That in universities, teaching is not a value, it's a production that is something else. So I teach, the work I do on gender has been focused in South Africa, in African American populations of color in the United States and in the Caribbean. So I'm going to sort of take a sort of more global idea of gender rather than specific areas. Because of my years as a university professor in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies and Women's Studies, and engaged in the practice of social justice, I concluded that perhaps the struggle for gender equality with university students was already too late. I have in high schools for the last 3 years developed and piloted the Gender Consciousness Project, which attempts to use Freirean and Gramscian theories to inculcate gender consciousness in girls from 15 years old. It is important to separate this idea from the many women's projects that speak about empowerment, which invariably conceive of the intervention as education-based. That once girls become educated, the quality of their lives improve on many levels. While this is true, education does not remove gender discrimination. That women can be successful and still be underpaid, become liabilities because of pregnancy, and also remain silent because they are fearful of losing their jobs. And these are educated women. It is here that their voice and agency are needed, and it's here that we can begin to erode the normalization of everyday acts of gender discrimination that women experience. A consciousness to recognize these acts, but more importantly, to think critically about ways to resist. It must start with young women, for as they evolve into adulthood, they become agents of their oppressors. That education may give you a career in economic security, but no recognition of being fully human. That you may work at Google and still must sue for higher wages. Hence the project of gender consciousness, that unless women begin to see the injustice that they face and the ways in which they participate in colluding with these injustices, we cannot progress. It is women who must resist, and it is women who must be able to see the very step of collusion that they take as they start on that road to victimhood. It is only when they see the real world that these young women can help to dismantle and rebuild it. Education is necessary, but that education is by and large still at its core male and white. That the so-called feminization of education has translated into women's presence in the workforce, but for the highest positions, women must still play by male rules. The Gender Consciousness Project is a grassroots program that builds awareness of the complexities of gender discrimination faced by young women simply because they are female. By understanding the societal forces that shape them, we build their agency to create a foundation for the struggle against injustices that they will face. Utilizing the principle of consciousness raising, that women themselves must understand their own oppression, and more importantly, how they themselves participate in their own oppression, the GCP engages high school females in conceptualizing how gender with other identities impact various facets of their lives. The GCP is a commitment to make women's injustice the work of women themselves, starting as early as possible, who must develop and articulate agency through small and labor-intensive work. The committees on which GCP focuses are girls of color who are in struggling communities or religious and ethnic minorities. We are in a pilot in Jamaica since we believe that the deep injustices women face simply because they are women is a global issue. But in girls who experience innumerable discriminations in the world, at the center of the project is critical. We grow the consciousness of each group to facilitate those who will engage for their own communities. Through several schools, 5 girls are selected, and then asked to pick a topic for a blog site that they will write and develop. The project cannot start unless the girls are central, not the facilitators, for example. For example, Nadia writes about her grandmother who was too light for the black kids and too dark for the white kids. This then led to a dialogue about race and color in the African American community. Katie said, "I always present myself as smaller and quiet because of my darker skin." In Jamaica, Jada and Brianna talk about bleaching and the value of girls. The complexities of aesthetics for black girls and what pushes them away from blackness are then passionately discussed. The separation from blackness affects women of all cultures. Rahaf, a Pashtun girl, speaks about her dark skin and dark eyes as too dark to be beautiful in her culture. A radical politics for women's agency must take on the politics of beauty. Muslim girls who cover their heads have now been weaponized as a threat to secular society. So it's here, so are women's wombs, their reproduction, their sexuality, their objectification in popular culture, and so on. There's no aspect of a woman's life that is not politicized. These dialogues are about ensuring that girls themselves are involved in dialectics of their inequality and ways of unraveling them. From this, they set up their own website as a shaper of social media rather than just a consumer. As the older students graduate, they recruit the next cohort. This use of social media is critical since it is the tablet of this generation. To point to one recent development, the high school students that we worked with for 2 years have now all been accepted to universities, including the University of Michigan. 3 of them will now become GCP interns and now take on the theoretical work and the training and supervision of the next cohort of university students. This is also a project of engaged learning or praxis. These are dialogue-based courses with primarily young women of color, led by critically thinking facilitators who guide participants in understanding the socio-political context of their individual experiences as young women. These are selected students who have been in my classes and who have spent a great deal of time preparing for these interventions by intense theoretical study and experiential training by previous students and participants who have already completed the project. These curated discussions over several months alongside a final technology-based project is at the heart of GCP. Because I have spent so many years in academia and women's studies, we have become weary of the unending streams of research and publications and politics and conferences of earnest discussion of the plight of women. I have become deeply committed to Gramsci's ideas of praxis and organic intellectuals. Bell Hooks is called to disrupt academic feminism, to return to projects like consciousness raising, and Paulo Freire's theories of conscientization. I say this specifically because this symposium is proposing a grand research project. I'm hoping that it will not be more of the same. An academic feminism has replaced the consciousness raising group as the primary site for the transmission of feminist thinking and strategies for social change. The movement lost its mass-based potential. Their displacement became complete once women's studies became entrenched in colleges and universities. This then is the objective of the GCP, to reclaim and modernize the project of consciousness raising. And this is an idea that I've taken from bell hooks. It is my struggle to both reject academia and transform academia into an agent of change. To challenge educational institutions that argue that they are helping communities when indeed the biggest beneficiaries are the institutions and their cohorts. They get credit for working with people, but what do the people get in return? Who are the biggest beneficiaries? The ubiquitous term empowerment here becomes a ruse for empowering the privileged and should be seriously challenged. Restraint, it is already a slogan. I talk about critically conscious facilitators, which we don't have, which we need to change, and the emergence of organic intellectuals who are people that you work with and you see when you work in communities. You know that they're brilliant, you know they understand injustice, they know that they can articulate and sort of want to resist, but there's no place to grow and train them. So we need that as a possibility. I want to also talk about finally what I want is a research project that is focused on action. We need to act. This for me is a primary interest. How can we structure the research project to examine or build projects of action? How can we make the sciences and the humanities more inclusive of women, even though it is women who teach and women who are hungering for education? How can we change the content of education, the curricula, the books, the training of teachers? I recall in 1989, I wrote a book called Blaze of Fire, a book written for high schools that spoke about the contributions of women's work in building our societies in the Caribbean. A very good friend of mine said that this book will never be used in the classroom. Why, I said, this was in 1989. Because teachers do not know how to teach gender, she said. And so she was right, the book was never accepted. It was offered, they took it, they put it on their shelves, and they said it was very nice. The book subsequently was used at funerals when the women I wrote about in the book died. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that women themselves are not invested in eradicating gender oppression on the front lines. And that university students who are going to be teachers and professionals themselves are not conscientized about gender. And so what I want to say is that we need to sort of rethink the whole construct of how we include gender, not just as a subject, but as an ideological commitment to changing how we think of gender across the board, internationally, not just poor women, but women in the North, in universities and in high school.
Fantastic, thank you. I mean, I spoke with each of the speakers briefly beforehand to find out what they plan on talking about, and then it's up to me to figure out how to make the order, and I actually think that this flowed very well, and that was a fantastic note to end on. So thank you for setting the stage for the conversation that we will now have. And I don't want to occupy with any questions or thoughts of my own, but I do want to remind everyone of our task that we've been given by yours truly.
There's a committee. I don't know where this illusion is coming from.
Schools 2030. So there's the 10-year longitudinal research study that we've heard some talk about today. One of the outcomes that we're hoping will come from these roundtables is to discuss on each of the thematic areas that we focused on, for us, gender responsive approaches to education. What are the questions and the gaps in knowledge or data that we would like to fill, given this unique opportunity to study 4 different age cohorts of children over a 10-year period? So that's really what we'd like to walk away with today, is questions that we would like to ask and perhaps ideas as to how to go about studying this around gender responsive approaches. And we don't have to dive into that just yet. I'll remind us maybe halfway through the discussion to try to narrow in on that. So for now, were there any kind of emerging thoughts or light bulbs that went off or questions that we'd like to probe our speakers on? And please